Racing you win again?
Yeah.
But you're ready up.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Jeez. Cool. Whole line terrified. People are on there. What's the big bullet on the left above the money?
I think it's the same thing. Actually, it might be hit by. What do you want that? Gosh. Well, it is hit by. Sure. I don't know why. Maybe if you want.
Wave to Ajitam, guys.
Where?
I'm streaming
Oh.
to him right now. On my fancy set.
We're playing Scott, I gotta beat Joey one sec. Oh, I just accidentally closed it out. I think that's for sure.
That's a good one.
Thanks for those kill steals, bro. Oh, grenades are really hard to use there.
Yeah.
I only got like 4 kills though.
I pushed it to like 39. Yeah, this probably was jumping the ball.
You guys want to start?
Yeah. Do I even have kill streak rewards at level 2?
I just noticed we're both wearing purple today.
Remember that day when I unintentionally matched with Lauren? That was hilarious.
Get it. Just the job you want. Damn. Just saying though, all these other people are at level 22. I'm level 2 and I take second. I'm coming for you. Just wait till I get the AK. We just finished. We're playing, COD just came out with a mobile version.
Always gotta be going.
I was gonna ask, how did you calculate the estimation?
Estimated velocity is a total of all of your tasks or that have been through it
Oh, this week or this
for
week?
this next sprint.
Also, I have a question.
Yeah.
I've been having this error and I did a whole bunch of different things to try to like fix it since the morning, but nothing is working. And I even Googled some, like nothing is working. It's driving me crazy.
What's there?
I'm pretty sure it's a syntax error somewhere, but it just says unexpected token, expected comma. And normally if I add the comma at the line that it expects it, it fixes it. But it didn't fix it. And then so uncommented a lot of stuff I commented out thinking that maybe there's something to do with that. That didn't work either. And then I did some other things. It's the formatting and make sure all the brackets lined up, but nothing fixed it. There's still one weird bracket, but it matches up. It's just a different color.
Is this supposed to be?
That was there. That was.
Just mark something down?
Yeah, I didn't know. Not even another color.
Why is it bracket?
Am I in your way?
Nope. If you're in the way, I'd let you know.
Fair enough. Is that a reference to something?
Nope. Nope, that's 100% him. What you guys looking at? Is that add member thing?
Huh?
Yeah.
It's the unexpected token thing.
Ah.
Which is literally a syntax error somewhere we can't find.
Yeah,
I'll
yeah.
show you like the tiny thing that I feel like probably is wrong, but I don't know what to do to fix it.
Okay.
Yeah. If you look at this bracket,
Yeah.
it matches up, well, it does not show the yellow bracket. I fixed it, so now they're both blue. But this one here, I used to match up with that one there, and now I want to match up with this one here. That was the only thing that I felt like could possibly be the issue. I fixed it, so I don't know why it's still doing that.
Oh, nice.
Let's do that for each function. So you can narrow down what functions and then do it in individual,
Lines,
not lines, like sections.
section.
Renata's showing us up on the Halloween, guys.
Huh?
Her house is like fully decked.
Where did you see this?
It's on Slack. Looks awesome.
Oh.
Jeez. Meanwhile, Justin's hanging Christmas.
Alrighty. I think I got my.
You started making Christmas lights.
We get around 200 kids at our yard.
Wow.
We've got 250 baskets.
Ah, because they know you've got the chocolate. Yes.
There's just so many kids. I wanted to be like a street party where they close the street, but I've never taken the initiative to do that. What are you saying?
Are you one of those houses that give out full-size chocolate bars? No, right? No one does that anymore. Yeah?
We give a bag of chips and a chocolate.
Candy chocolate?
That's pretty good.
That's pretty good.
Like small chocolate.
I'll be there. So I think I've got my setup ready here, guys, whenever you're ready. So I did a little thing and I just like hooked up this camera and I'm streaming it so that Ajitam can check that out because I'm sort of like dividing between that screen and this stuff. Yep, it's live now.
I'm gonna get the vlog.
So hopefully he can hear it okay. There's a little bit of lag, like a few seconds lag between what we're doing and when he'll see it, but the quality should be good. So I'm just streaming to YouTube. So
So like everyone can see it, not just
Is it
like
live?
all two of my viewers.
Tim.
You'd think I'd be more famous, right? I've been working on it for so long.
I'm gonna be on Tim's vlog.
So where do I sit?
Yeah.
This feels like-
So I'm gonna jump in this chair here so I can bring up a couple of slides. So if you guys are set, then I'll just kind of launch into it.
We're gonna move this way.
And I'll make sure that I'm switched to the right camera. So this right now is a classic maker problem. You guys hopefully saw the first project I put on project board, which was like a live switcher. Because I'm often doing this kind of a setup where I want to like use a whiteboard or something like that. And with my students, I'd always forget. Like I'd go to the whiteboard view and then I'd forget, and then go back to coding or whatever. And when I check the chat window, people would be losing their minds because they can't see anything I'm doing. So I created that. It was like one of my first projects in the maker space, but that's sort of jumping ahead. I'm going to switch this back to the desktop view. Yeah, maybe shoot him a message, because I sent him the link. We checked it earlier today. It was working pretty good. Yeah, I couldn't afford a producer, so I made something to do live switching. But I don't really have time to hook it up today. So I thought it's is Jitam? I'll just do some preamble. I thought it's a good time to talk about some of this stuff, because in a previous conversation we were talking about like if people know like what is a maker or what is this maker movement and kind of thing. And you guys are aware by now that we've been talking with a group that is probably the most noteworthy group in terms of the maker movement. They've had a global impact, and so it's pretty cool that, like, it's very exciting to me that we're talking with them. because I sort of stumbled sideways into the whole maker movement. And I thought I could show you a little bit of the progression in the form of talking about the Raspberry Pi. So as far as it goes, the Raspberry Pi is probably one of the most recognizable artifacts of the maker movement after 3D printing. And I've set up a little museum of Raspberry Pis here, and also included a couple of 3D prints so we could take a look at what we're talking about here. So probably the first thing we should cover, like, what is a Raspberry Pi? What is this thing? So it's basically a single board computer. And there's been 4 versions of it that have come out, and then like a lot of like secondary versions, like minor versions and so forth. But the 4 of them, the specs sort of break down like this. Now I've only included like the most significant specs in this, one of them being the price, right? So when the version 1 came out, you could get it for $25, which made it like one of the most inexpensive, fully featured computers ever created. Even more remarkable given that it was manufactured in the UK, which is pretty rare these days. And so how did this come about? Well, one of the major ways that it happened was they pretty much stripped away everything you don't need on a computer, including the case, including cooling, including an on-off switch, like literally stripped it down to the main board. But then they were able to add in a few things that you often don't get access to. And I'm going to talk about the mission that they were on when they designed this board and who were the people that came up with it and why they did that. So I'm going to pop over to the table here for a second if you guys want to take a quick look. Camera switch. Come on, Jada. So just while we're waiting, giving a few minutes for Jitam. So how did I get into all this stuff? Well, I was running my own company and doing a lot of development work. For about 5 or 6 years, I did a lot of work in Flash, and that technology got deprecated. So I had learned a lot. The language for Flash was called ActionScript, AS4, and it's very similar to like a Java. It's like a mix of Java and C# kind of thing, but with the and at one time, like being a Flash developer was very good, because like they were highly in demand and making like pretty top dollars if you knew what you were doing. Because Flash commanded 98% of all media serving. All videos were served via Flash, all online games were served via Flash, so it was a very cool creative tool. Every ad agency wanted to use it, and it come to the point that full-on software development was being done in it. People were making video editors using Flash. They were like making all kinds of pretty serious software. But Steve Jobs got up on stage and said, "No more Flash." And that was the end of the party. Basically, he said, we're not putting it on any Apple devices for these reasons, etc. And like, I would say within a year, probably 80% of the business had dropped off that I used to do in Flash. And so I started doing all kinds of other things, but it was, quite frankly, it was a pretty boring time for me because HTML5 was not up to snuff yet. And not enough browsers had adopted it for me to do the kind of work that I was used to doing that was like really interactive. So there was this gap period in which I got interested in other things and examined a lot of different technologies and so forth. One of the things we did was sort of sideline into doing interactive installations. And that got us into more hardware work, and we did a lot of work for big events like Auto Show and things like that. So I had my own lab, and I'm going to show you like a little clip from my lab. And that's sort of how I became aware that this maker stuff was going on, but I wasn't really involved with it. Like, you know, I was learning, but I wasn't part of any communities. I didn't go to any meetup groups or things like that. I was pretty much just doing my thing and running my company and so forth. So that's probably as much preamble as I've got. So hopefully we've got a G2 on the line. Because I'm just going for it. I mean, he'll join in, and I'll catch him up if he has any questions. So I mentioned that the Raspberry Pi was like one of the iconic things that we associate with the maker movement, and I've actually got the version 1 here. These are a little bit hard to get a hold of these days because this, of all the Raspberry Pis, this is the one that's no longer in production anymore. Surprisingly, the rest are still in production. You can still buy them, but it's got a couple of unique features on it. First off, it's the only one that's got a composite output for video. So like old style TV signal, RCA type stuff, you can do it from this one. So like for older monitors or like legacy technology, it's got support for it. It's got the full Ethernet port on here and 2 little USB 1 connectors here. And but then it also had the HDMI connection here. So it was cool that you could have both composite and HDMI from this little board. And for $25, they packed a lot into this thing. Now, one of the features that's remained constant with the Raspberry Pi through all the iterations is that they run off SD cards. This is the only one that runs off of like a full-sized SD. And when they went to like the micro SDs, a lot of people complained about that because they're just easy to break and they're easy to lose and stuff. But like this board, I would say is one of the most revolutionary devices that have been created because it was purpose-built specifically for education. So there's kind of 3 ways that the Raspberry Pi has gained adoption. The first is through the original intended use as an educational tool. The second, the maker community got their hands on it and loved it and started building all kinds of crazy stuff with it. But then third, people also, like out of those things, people came to realize that it's actually a very capable little media device. It takes a different approach. Like you may wonder, like, why do I need this when I have something like my phone, right? And the phone is more powerful, there's no doubt about it. But the phone is a tool that tries to be all things to everybody at one time, right? So the phone needs to have an operating system on it. And then, you know, you get apps and you install them on it. They share the memory, they share the CPU and so forth. And a big part of the operating system's job is managing all of that stuff. So in reality, if you don't need all of that, if you don't need the operating system, for example, then you can make a device that is much less powerful do some really amazing stuff because all the resources are committed to that one task. And that's kind of the way that the Raspberry Pi is designed. So the tiny little memory card that we see in here, the little micro SD, this can be my media center. I'm going to show you a site called Kodi, which is like an open source media center, and it runs on this. But this can also be my display, like my digital signage, right? So running on these 2 screens here are a couple of Pis with a software called Screenly installed. And I'm going to show you how I can actually control those online. So if I've got a store or restaurant or something like that, if I spend $40, I can have like a really good digital signage solution that would have cost many thousands of dollars in the past. And that's really cool. It's like with this thing so small, if I have 6 of these, like it's the size of my pinky, you know, and 6 of those and 1 of these, there's a ton of things I can do. I brought along one of the projects that we're doing with the Junior World Builders. This one actually belongs to Nathan, who is custom making a game console. And So like, it's the exact same computer, but you know, with the right accessories attached up to it, this can play thousands of games, which is pretty amazing because it can run dedicated emulators. And unlike running that in your phone, it's just running the emulator. There's nothing else to sap the system resources there. So they run amazingly well. Like you can play everything up to like GameCube and PSP on the one device. But then if you get tired of that, you want to watch a movie, you just swap the SD card. And now you've got like a dedicated media center. And then if you want to do some programming, you swap the card again, and you've got like a dedicated programming environment. And if you need an operating system, it has that too. So the most popular one that people use is called Raspbian, and it's a version of Debian Linux. And so that was released by the creators of the board. It's the officially accepted operating system for it. But if you want another one, you know, there's like dozens of others that you can try out. So this was one of the big original goals, was to make the Raspberry Pi a tool for learning. So let me jump to my next slide here. And just before we leave this slide, I want to mention a little bit about the architecture of the thing. So the first version of the Pi, the early one that I showed you there, it used the same CPU that the first version of the iPhone had. So this is based on the ARM architecture. Are you guys familiar with like the differences between ARM architecture pioneered by Acorn and Broadcom versus like the Intel-based stuff? So there's always been two schools of thought in computing. The first being that saving power is important, and the second being that doing more computations is important. And this one always has won out. Intel has become a massive company based on that by packing more and more power into their CPUs, but generally by using more electricity, using more power, right? And people didn't care. I used to drop like 1,400 watt power supply in my desktop and be like, yeah, give me more watts, right? But like, I've kind of changed my tune on that, along with a lot of other people. And it's mostly because of the mobile movement. Like one of the most distinguishing features in our consumer products now is how long does the battery last? You're gonna have an amazing, like this is why Windows Phone didn't take off and you know, basically died, because they could not keep up in the mix between power and battery life. It was like a big feature, and that's mostly because Windows was based off of Intel-based architecture. All their software was based around that. Now, over the years, Windows has occasionally flirted with the ARM architecture and done some experiments. And probably within the next year, we're going to see them invest a lot more heavily in the ARM-based architecture, because they need to do that. Like Windows Phone failed, they cannot have Surface fail. And the next, I don't know if you guys watched any of the recent announcements about the next line of products that Microsoft's coming out with in the Surface line, but they're getting much more phone-like. And they also learned a lot of lessons, because while they were moving along the Intel path, another company advanced along the ARM path much more, which is, anybody? Apple, right? So Apple has always been very adamant about pushing their mobile experience. In fact, I think if they could, they would just drop their desktops and they'd drop their laptops, and they would direct everybody towards phones and tablets. And the reason why is because they've invested heavily in advancing the ARM architecture based on the gamble that people are going to want to go mobile, and they're going to want to be able to have their devices with them all the time and have them run all the time. And so Interestingly, the humble little Raspberry Pi is hanging out in the same camp with Apple in this regard. They went to the ARM architecture, and they benefited from a lot of Apple and Broadcom's research in being able to get these things into mass production much less expensively. Their processor has followed behind the path that Apple blazed, but rather than trying to make like some competing device to Apple, they didn't do that. They got the benefit of the research, but said, let's produce something that's different. Let's produce something that's for hackers and DIY enthusiasts and people who need to learn programming. So we see the ARM architecture up to ARM version 7, and then Cortex-A5 here on the version 3 of the Pi is also ARM-based. So is version 4, and so for my purposes, like as a maker, I would use these different versions in different circumstances. If I need really low power use and extremely long battery life, the version 1 is going to use like 5 watts or less. I can run it forever. The version 2 hits a sweet spot because it's a little faster. It's still got the MPEG decoding if I need any video purposes. It's got up to 1 gig of RAM that it shares with the GPU. So if you're not doing GPU stuff, you can just like turn that off and have all the memory for processing. So another efficiency. And I can still run it off the battery, and it doesn't need any active cooling. No fan required on the thing. By the time we get to the version 3, now I've got like a good level of processing power. Like I can make interactive experiences with it. But if I'm pushing it, I might need to put on the active cooling, which is kind of like a little extra step that's sort of a hassle depending on what you're doing. By version 4, which has just come out like a few months ago, it's starting to become like a little bit of a desktop contender. You can pretty much run your daily life with the thing, but now it needs a fan. It doesn't have a full-size HDMI port anymore. So it's a little bit getting away from the original intent of the thing. I guess it's not surprising. They've been doing this for a while. And so to introduce something new, it's going to start becoming more like what we're used to seeing here. So who are these guys?
Good question.
Yeah.
The fan, just like an external one, just plug in that?
Yeah, basically like you could pull any little fan out of your regular computer and drop it on there. Like it doesn't need a lot in terms of cooling. With the version 4 there, you see a lot of people selling like both passive and active cooling solutions. Sometimes it's just a copper, like a large size copper heat sink that they put on it. It does a pretty good job. But you can feel it, like when I start this thing up, if I'm doing anything notable, it'll start heating up pretty good, and like you could damage it, and then it'll actually thermal throttle the same as any other computer will do. Yeah, that's a good question, Joey. Anybody else wondering about like the hardware itself?
I have a question too. When you say something that's ARM-based, you're just saying that it can last a long time and do a lot of things?
No, yeah, good question. I should talk a little bit more about that because ARM architecture, it's a completely different architecture from what we're used to in our Intel-based processors. So you hear x86. This is the architecture that the chip designers use in Intel, and they have since day one, and it's very hard to imagine them ever changing from that because retooling factories to do a different architecture is wildly expensive. But there was another group. When I was in high school, believe it or not, I used a computer called an Acorn, and it's a computer that came out of the UK, and they struck deals with some high schools and educational institutions, and so they got this computer into schools, and quite by accident, they designed a processor that used a fraction of the power in terms of electricity that other processors do. And they lost out because everybody didn't care about how much power they were using. It was kind of like, you know, when we didn't care about how much gas you were using or how many cigarettes you smoked or anything like that. You know, it's like, whatever, we've got tons of power. And, you know, and Intel just blew them away. But there was always some specialized uses that did care about it, things like medical instruments. And then, you know, then when mobile phones came along, they're like, well, we just can't do these Intel processors. So you don't find an Intel processor in a phone, even up to now. They're all going to be like Snapdragon, they're going to be ARM-based processors. And like Apple is notable in that all of their devices that they're coming out with are ARM-based, and they're even talking about using it in the desktop now. Like the rumor is that's what's going to happen next. They've done it before. Like there was a brief time when Apple moved away from Intel processors, and they switched over to another processor. I forget. Do you remember the name, Renata? Like there was a little while when Macs, like full-size Macs, used. I can't remember the name, but they basically designed their own processor, and they tried to make that work for a while, but it just didn't have the power. And people were like, oh, we want our Intel processors. So they switched back again, but they've very clearly always wanted to get away from that. And they've got enough money and research now that they can probably do it. And now Microsoft, like they have a version of the Surface Book that's ARM-based, called the X4, that's going to be coming out. And they're like, it's the highest processing per watt that you can get. And they're starting to incorporate that into their marketing, because it basically translates to how long can I use this thing before I have to recharge it, or do I have to carry a big heavy charger around? Nobody wants that. So it's really interesting to... Speaking of which, you'd think I planned it, right? Hold on. Intel processor in this thing. Man. Okay, so so looking at the origins of the thing, it was designed to be an educational tool. So it's kind of an interesting story because I've been in education, all of you guys have been in education to some degree, and my experience as a teacher in education was a lot of complaining, not a lot of fixing. And it's really hard. But the Pi is a little bit different story because like in 2006, there were 4 computer science teachers from the University of Cambridge who, you know, said, we're not producing enough quality here in the students that we're producing. Not just us, but education in general. And so their thought was, we have to go downstream. We have to get to people before they arrive at university and college. And we need to get technology into their hands. And you may say, well, like every kid has technology. Like every kid's got access to phones and tablets and so forth. But the thing is, these are closed off black boxes. The fact that a kid can pick up and use a tablet does not mean he understands what's going on or she understands what's going on with the thing. And, you know, there's a disconnect there because you can't actually get inside the thing and do something with it to see how it works. And so they came up with the idea of producing like an inexpensive computer that would actually be a full-featured computer. And they come up with the early designs of the Raspberry Pi, but it was too expensive. And they couldn't actually produce it at any kind of scale until, as I say, other companies like Broadcom and Apple started getting involved. And you know, they came out with their versions of devices that changed the tooling in the factories and brought the costs way down, and suddenly it was viable and they could actually produce it. So like fast forwarding to today, the Raspberry Pi has sold like more than 19 million units. It is by far the most sold general purpose computer in the world, which is pretty amazing. And so, yeah, so basically the features that we see on it, like if I bounce back to our little museum there for a second, I can point out a couple of things. So taking a look at it now, this will be nothing new for Maisha, but maybe for some of the rest of us, there'll be some new features here. To the side, so this is the version 2. This is the second one that came out. This is probably my favorite out of all of these. I find it the most useful because I use these a lot in like hardware projects and stuff. And like to the side here, you see all these pins lined up. It's called the GPIO pins. Stands for general purpose input output pins. Basically all of them digital pins. Now that's pretty good, but when you get into building projects and doing electronics and that kind of thing, you quickly realize that we're not as digital as we think we are. All of the really cool stuff, all the really fun stuff you want to do is analog, right? Because all sensors, for example, all sensors that I know of are analog. And then they get translated into a digital signal. And that's the ADC, exactly. So what I will often do on projects is I will team up the Raspberry Pi with some of the friends of Pi that I've brought along here. So this is an Arduino board. The Arduino Uno is very well known. This is not actually an Arduino Uno. This is like a cheap Chinese knockoff. It even says Uno on it though, but I got it for like $6. For the most part, it works okay. I probably wouldn't use this on a production project because it may let me down. But what I'll do is, like, as an example, this isn't going to be a good device for things like controlling motors. It isn't going to be good for reading sensory data and so forth, because most of those are going to be based on something like PWM, which is a pulse width modulation. And like, to explain PWM very simply, it's essentially turning on or off a digital signal very quickly. And the frequency that you do that at gives you essentially an approximation of an analog signal. So for example, if you want to know how cold it is outside, you start off with a substrate whose electrical properties change based on temperature. Then you apply a known current through it, and then you read the resistance of that, basically, because it's acting like a resistor, and that gives you an idea of what the temperature is. But then you have to take that analog signal and convert it into something digital. So I will often team these guys up by connecting them through the serial port. And I will use this for the very good analog sensory features and have it report into the Pi. Because this guy is a real pain in the butt to connect to the internet or something like that. It's also harder to program for, you know, whereas with this, I can program in pretty much any language that I want to. I can connect it to the internet very easily. I can plug in a keyboard. Unlike with this, I can't, you know. So I'll pair them up and get the best of both worlds from it. And a lot of makers and people who do this kind of stuff will do that. I might even go further. So this, I'm going to show you a project that I used this combination on. This is a Pololu motor driver controller, right? So I can use this for controlling any kind of like larger size motors, higher current motors, higher voltage motors, and so forth. And it'll do a great job. This guy basically, well, you can see, can be plugged in like what they call a hat, plugged directly into the pins of the Arduino. Then the Arduino gets connected through the serial to this guy. Now I've got the best of everything. I've got really good motor drivers. I've got very good analog control and sensor reading. And then I've got good computing power and internet connectivity through this. Plus, I can plug in a display very easily, right? 'Cause standard HDMI. So that's pretty cool. So think if you're like making some kind of cool interactive experience and you want a kiosk involved where people can plug in their information and get sent a photo or a video of it, perfect use case for that. And the whole package, like this guy, $25. This guy, as I said, I got the knockoff version, $6. This guy, maybe $12, around there, you know, so cheap. It's a cheap hobby with infinite amount of things that you can do, which is awesome. And as I say, like I have lots of different versions of Pis because I'll use them for different things. Like if that display that I'm doing is going to be a lot more CPU intensive and I need more graphics processing power, I can bump up to the Raspberry Pi 3. But what's cool is they're backwards compatible all the way down, right? So I can take the same micro SD card and plug it into any one of these devices and still use it. If it's something really heavy, I'm not going to get a good performance out of this guy, and certainly not out of this guy, you know. But if I find like, oh, it's running badly, I need more power, I can just bump it up, you know, until I get the power that I need. So that's super flexible. A couple other little guys that I brought along, like simple little relay, right? So this one I can plug directly onto the Pi itself because all this guy needs is an on or an off signal. The relay clicks in, but this would be connected to something bigger. So like, I've made projects before where like I made a cooker, a little cooker, you know, that I can set a timer for it and have it turn on or off, or like, you know, I can hook up sensors then and be like, oh, when I come in the door, it should start cooking up my food and then turn off when I turn the lights off or something like that, you know? So you can do a lot of like really cool creative stuff with this. So on that note, I'll move along like to the second big use, which was like the maker movement. And let's talk about that. I'm gonna show you guys a little bit of stuff. Yeah, so it's a favorite of the maker movement. So what is the maker movement? I think a lot of people would answer that the maker movement is basically like DIY people, or people who like to build things and so forth. But it's actually a little bit more than that, because we've always had those people, and no one ever described it as a movement before. So I would answer it by saying, looking at the other movements that we've seen happen through history and what their purpose was. So for example, through history, we always have these situations where if people feel like their lives are being automated too much, if they're being told what to do too much, if they're being treated basically like robots, some people don't like that. And they rebel against it in various ways. And sometimes it's amazing. So Gothic architecture is a good example of a movement where basically the workers who were building the castles and things like that said, you know what, it's beautiful to see flaws, because that tells you a real person with real traits built that castle. And so they started doing all kinds of crazy things like putting in a picture window, and just because they wanted it there, you know. Later on in history, we have examples like the arts and crafts movement, right? Similar kind of thing when production, like large-scale production started to kick off. There were people who were like, you know what? We don't like it. We don't like it. We're going to go back to like the handmade stuff. And I would say that today, like we have so much choice, and as consumers, that we're in a similar kind of position where we actually value something that's handmade. And if you take that same thinking and apply it to technology, there's a growing body of people who got concerned with the fact that, like those 6 Cambridge professors, concerned with the fact that we're surrounded by technology. It's in every facet of our lives, and do we really know how it works? And you know, the best way to know how something works is to build it, or some crappy version of it, you know? So when somebody builds a crappy robot, what they're really doing is like understanding how robotics works. you know, so that they can make informed choices. And the maker movement, that is basically the goal of the maker movement, is to make sure that we understand how this stuff works and to make sure that everybody has access to it. And, you know, so when a guy builds his own iPhone, it's way more expensive than it would be to just go out and buy an iPhone, and it's really hard, and it's, you know, a lot of people would say that's a fool's errand, like why would you do that? But it's not about getting an iPhone. It's about building yourself, your knowledge, your understanding, and, you know, just becoming a more informed person and maybe building your skill levels and so forth. So a very notable thing that happened that sort of, I would say, like kicked off this movement was a gathering in 2008 that was called Maker Faire. And there had been like smaller events of this kind prior, but this one in San Mateo drew a lot of people. Like a lot of makers came out to it, and they did a really good job with it, and they drew a lot of media attention that hadn't really been there before. And this was done by a company called Make, who were the publishers of Make Zine, which was kind of like almost like a Popular Mechanics or Popular Science type of magazine, but more for the DIY crowd. And they were the organizers of the first Maker Faire, and also organized for the media to, you know, come out and take notice of what was going on and so forth. And, you know, so today it's moved along to there being hundreds of events like this, and it happens globally all over the place. And, you know, with the internet, people have been able to share information. So we see websites like Thingiverse that have appeared, where you can download people's models and 3D print them. GitHub, I would actually put in the same vein, where it's like a big hub for sharing code and reviewing code and so forth. So these guys have been really, really influential in this. They essentially, I would say, they made it a movement, whereas it was like a lot of scattered people doing their own thing. And these are actually the folks that we are now partnering with, which is, I mean, that's impressive. To me, that's like really cool. And I think that Project Board has a strong role to play in this, which is pretty great. I mean, we were talking about it the other day, like what happens if this takes off in schools, for example. Well, that would be very much in the spirit of the Maker movement that came out of educational efforts like these guys from Cambridge. So I can give you the whirlwind tour of a few of my projects that I've worked on, and I've used the Raspberry Pi quite a lot in a lot of them. I want to show you my first project that I would say is my first project in the actual maker movement, I guess you would say. And I like to show a lot of my students this because people getting started often feel like this is going to be really hard. They don't have the skills to do it and so forth. And I like to show this first project here because here I am. I'm at CSI, the other location, I think the one on Bathurst, if I remember correctly. And this was a little meetup group. This is pretty much all of us. I'm taking the picture, so you don't see me. But my friend there had organized it. And this was one of the other profs at the college. And so they said, you know, come out and try out this thing with Arduino. And I was like, okay, it seems, because my friend was organizing it, I thought, oh, sure, I'll give it a try. I had made some experiments on my own and so forth, but like doing it with other people was something I'd not really done, other than people that I paid. So it seems like a really simple little project here. But it did kind of stir my imagination because there's the little Uno, like this is a real Uno. And if you look carefully, it's being used to program this tiny little guy up here. This is called a Teensy. It's the same architecture as the Uno down here. So now we're like programming one board to program another board here. And I thought that was kind of neat. And after I did a little bit of research about the maker movement, there was a group called the RepRap Society, and they're the ones who popularized 3D printers, and their whole idea was making machines that make machines. And so here we were doing a simple example of it, and you can see it's just got one little LED light here, you know? And you could say like, well, what's the point of that? That's not very interesting at all. It just like lights up a little LED light. But this is where the artistic side and the creative side of the maker comes in, because well, I'll show you the next little slide here, and we're using laser cut little templates here for a little bit of origami, so some traditional craft combined with a modern fabrication method, and out of it we get this little guy, right? So now the little light is becoming a little bit more magical. But it went further than that because all of us together made like a little city block, right? And then this installation went to FITC, where hundreds of people participated in it and built an entire city. And in that city, we programmed our little lights to blink in Morse code and send a secret message. So anybody who had an app that could read Morse code could put it up and decode the message of each person who had participated in the event.
What was your message?
Not saying. But that's cool, right? And it made me think, because if I was just doing this project just myself, not exciting. No big deal, right? But because it was me and other people all doing it together, suddenly it's something like pretty cool and magical. And so I started to get it, you know, and realize like why people came together to do this kind of thing and join community spaces and so forth.
Yeah, I feel like you can definitely bounce ideas off of people who like think like you, and so like these kind of meetups are for that purpose, right?
Yeah. Now, from the original little blinky light project, things started to kind of take off. And here, I'll show you. Where's my...
Wasn't necessary.
Calorie stampede.
Yeah. So I want to show you this little project. So this was using software served up on a Raspberry Pi. It's a teleprompter, right? So like the same kind of teleprompter that the weather person will read off of, or news anchor or something like that. Those things cost a lot of money. And so I made this little cardboard prototype, but I did send off and get like the nice beam splitter glass that they use in this that gives a nice sharp image. And then I wrote the software for serving up the text, and it worked pretty good. I was like, now I've got a teleprompter. That's kind of neat. Oh my God, I can make my own show. And so from there, it went to this. And so I'm actually controlling the whole light grid through automation and so forth, and I can queue up RGB control, and it's like serving me up a histogram so that I can get a good green screen effect out of it and so forth. And you know, so this is all like, I'm doing this in my own little lab area kind of thing. But this got me into the camera-based capabilities of the Raspberry Pi. Now I've brought along one of the units up here. This actually has a little built-in camera in it. It's very, very small. The camera accessories for the Raspberry Pi look like this, right? So it's tiny. It's the same kind of camera that you'd find in your cell phone, right? But what's cool is like this isn't like a super powerful camera, but the fact that the Pi is fully programmable gives me much more control of this camera than your phone would. Your phone is going to limit your control of the camera to software that's going to be accessible to all users, right? I want a lot more control of that.
Can you give an example? Like, what do you mean?
Yeah, for a long time, you couldn't control the exposure. They said that's too much for people. We should do auto exposure.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's terrible. You know, like half the time you get a bad looking photo from that. But more than that, I feel like as a human being, I can figure it out. You know, like I should be able to do that. But they're trying to just sell phones, right? So they don't want to give you too much control, because then for some people it's going to seem like too complex, and so you're going to get something that's the lowest denominator, basically. And in a lot of situations, that's not going to cut it. So from the interesting cameras and using the Raspberry Pi, I started to get requests for commercial work. And one of them we were approached by was Calgary Stampede. And so I worked on this little guy. And I actually have one of the units here. It's a little beat up, but basically a ruggedized version of the camera that I was using in my own little recording studio, right? So we have like a milled aluminum body on the thing. And we also created from Sugru like sealable sections on the bottom here to seal off the ports and so forth. And the reason why was because we were asked to participate in one of the large installations at the Calgary Stampede. So if you've ever played the carnival game where you got to use a squirt gun and hit a target and it like makes a prize go up, it's like imagine that, except your squirt gun is like a fire hose and the prize is a full-size truck, like an actual GM truck, right? Being lifted up. You could actually win a truck. So that, and what they wanted to do was basically, they were putting a lot of money into that sponsorship, so they wanted to enlarge the audience for it. And so we basically designed and created all of the media aspects of the thing. And so these cameras would basically start recording when people were participating in the event and create time lapses out of it and grab frames and figure out which frames were the best looking. Take those, send them off to servers we had set up that brought those images into displays that made the person appear in a wanted poster. So by the time you were leaving, you'd be walking by these wanted posters of you like firing at the thing. So yeah, probably got some hanging around. We got some nice media mention too, like Twilio, the company that very popular company, mentioned us in their company blog and so forth. And I have a little clip of the experience here so you can sort of see what that was all about.
This is the Calgary Stampede, the greatest outdoor show on earth. It's a wild 10-day affair that attracts roughly 1.2 million hardworking Western Canadians looking to let loose. Amid this crazy environment, we were challenged to create an engaging activation for the 2015 GMC Sierra HD that featured the truck in a premium but contextually relevant manner. Our solution seemed simple enough: give a classic midway game a GMC professional-grade makeover. So we selected the iconic water racer as the focus. For our version, we wanted to swap out the weak water pistols with something more akin to the power of a GMC, boring bullseyes with moving targets, and fluffy stuffed animals with unmodified 7,000-pound Sierra HD trucks. Which left but one question: could it be done?
It's either gonna go or it's not.
Yeah.
There's no not.
True.
Step one, find a partner who can bring our vision to life.
So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here,
Plan and test.
because this kind of thing is the world I plunged into.
Okay, it's over.
You know, and
Vinyl banners, operational, wired in, ready to go.
so I want to show you a quick little, hold on, you get the idea. But like down here, sorry, I just want to,
This project 2 months outside of Stampede, you know, you're
so like, we were not the principals on this project. We were brought in for the media stuff, for the camera work and programming and stuff specifically. But while doing it, I got to view what a guy like this does, you know? And like this space that he's working in has a surprising resemblance to the space we have right downstairs here. Like the CNC machine he's working on is the same one we have in the space here. So like, it sparked my interest. I was like, that's neat what he's doing. And I'm doing something kind of similar. And I bet I could do this. And so while this project was on, I was approached by another client who wanted to talk about doing the Pan Am Games. And so this is where that project I've mentioned before comes in, where we're approached to do essentially the world's largest slot car track. And for that, we were the principals and did the entire thing, like all aspects of it. And it dwarfs this project. So I'll jump ahead to that one real quick. I don't want to keep you guys too long, but it's worth checking out. Because this project is using Raspberry Pis all over the place. So like here's a little image of the Raspberry Pi being mounted inside of one of the cars so that I can get sensory information and so forth. They also wanted to do in-dash cameras for the cars. So as they're going around, you could get the perspective from inside the car. Yeah. Now, if you think about it, like that's a very challenging task because you got a lot of radio interference in the environment, right? So we wanted to operate on basically Wi-Fi signal, which would work a lot better than say like the signal you would get from like drone camera or something like that. So there's a lot involved with this project. I'm just gonna quickly go through. This is one of the sensors we used. If you've ever played slot cars as a kid, you know that when you're pushing it and you're going fast, you're gonna spin out on a corner, right? But when you're a kid, that's easy. You just reach out, you put it back on again and you keep going. But when that spin out is 2/3 of a kilometer away, you cannot just put the car back on. Like you're gonna be ruined at the end of the day rushing over there trying to fix it. So we embedded hundreds and hundreds of sensors inside of the track, and we tested like a half a dozen different styles of sensors before we came up with this magnetic sensor that give us the most accurate results. And these are all reporting through Arduinos hooked up to Pis to like a central Linux server that we're using for regulating the movement of all of the cars on the track. And so if somebody's going too fast as they're heading to a bend, the system learns after a couple of spins out and knows you're going too fast. Actually auto slows down the car as you're heading into the turn. So it's like an auto braking thing that it's doing. And it's doing it for all the cars at one time. But we don't want to cheat people because it's a race, right? So what we do is we store up how much energy it was reduced by, and when they get around the bend, it sends a signal to this display that we have running in front of the person saying, you have a speed boost available. They get to hit this button, and we actually blur the screen as their car takes off on the straightaway. So we take something that like could be a bad experience and turn it into something really fun and cool. There's one of our like cheesy early tests. This one, hold on. Yeah, we're working in the lab, working on a 9-foot version of the track. This is our prototype with 2 cars. And the thing is, like, we had to get the entire system working on this. And then we would have like 3 days to go from this to the full 2/3 of a kilometer track with 16 tracks on it. So that's a big old gamble right there, because there's a big difference between 9 feet and 2/3 of a kilometer.
2 cars and 16.
Yeah, it's a lot of planning. There's some of the Linuxers, there's the Pis all lined up, getting tested in the cars here. There's tried a couple of different styles of cameras to get better results out of the feeds from the cars. And then there's my I called this Cerebro. This was the central tower that was managing all the PID processes and so forth. In addition to controlling the cars, it had to get all of the information from the bikes as people were pedaling and generating the electricity. And it also had to monitor the power that was going to the central battery tower, and then from the tower to the cars. So we worked with the engineers from Chevy for that. A lot of work. Oh, security photos, because Pan Am Games, security is very tight. I'm giving you the whirlwind tour here, but you can see the production on all of these things. In addition to controlling all of the, you can sort of see a little bit of the on-screen interface we're developing and designing there. And so this is getting, as I say, like converting those analog signals into digital, but then serving it up in this cool interface that would be on people's screens, because we don't want them like twisting and turning trying to see their car while they're on this bike. Like that could be disastrous. So we mounted using systems very much like that cheap little selfie stick with a camera mounted to it were placed all around the perimeter of the track. And using the same systems we used to monitor the cars and regulate their speeds, we used it for live camera switching, so that as you're pedaling, you could actually, we could time it so that as your car is coming around a bend, it would cut to just the right camera for you to see this epic shot of your car going by. And then would switch again to like an overhead camera so you'd see it in this like really seamless set of cuts that would happen as you're participating in the thing. So yeah, I have a bunch of photos. Here's like during construction, but I'll jump now to just a little video clip that will give you the overall and give you a good indication of what we're doing here. Yeah, here we go. Nice, right? Doesn't it look good? So this has a little little interview with the engineer from Chevy that we worked with. Time lapse of the whole construction happening. It's my friend Duncan. Bunch of the markety folks. Dave Stubbs, longtime friend of mine. At the time, I didn't know how they had done this. Now I do. We have one of those machines downstairs.
So there's other ways that we can generate electricity. We can do things like magnetic tracks, upper arm cycles, rowing machines, all things that perhaps people haven't thought of in ways that we are looking for opportunities to build this in the future. And so we're open to ideas, and I think the opportunity is to look for the people that are experienced, have gone to the games, have experienced activation, and come up with a way of gathering information from those and help that drive the opportunity for the future.
Isn't that cool?
Okay, so what we have
This is just a little behind the scenes from my
is a
lab.
Raspberry Pi computer
I mean,
with the camera module attached. Now the Raspberry Pi is being controlled through the native Raspberry Vid application.
I'll let it run for a second. Are you guys interested in this little bit here? This will be the last thing I'll
That is
end up
capturing
on.
from the camera, which you can see the LED is on, indicating that the camera is going. And I am piping that directly into GStreamer. Okay? GStreamer is streaming via the wireless dongle out to a Linksys router on which I have installed the open source firmware called DDWRT in order to tweak that slightly. It is streaming UDP H.264 encoded video. Now over here on the laptop, I have GStreamer hooked up here as well to receive the UDP stream. It is then live transcoding it into a VP8 stream, inserting it into WebM. I have a node server running, which receives requests, opens up a TCP server, and can grab the output of the encoding that's happening through GStreamer. Now, because of that, I'm actually able to bring the feed coming from the Raspberry camera into HTML, bypass the security features of the browser, and show that feed in real time.
That's my belly.
In a 3D environment using 3JS WebGL. And so you can see that that's actually fully functional, and there's me waving hi. So that's true 3D real-time live feed coming from a Raspberry Pi camera.
Boom. Oh, yeah, tests, early tests there. So, yeah, so from a blinky light, you know, like it's just adding a little to your knowledge each day and adding a little something and practicing, and you know. So that was my progress, and then we actually did win the Guinness World Record, and I met the guy from Guinness. So cool. Yeah, it's like a jacket with a patch on it and everything, like an official book that he writes you in. That was really neat. But it was that was an extremely stressful project. A lot of pressure, because like all those people working on this thing, their work is all for nothing if my piece doesn't do its job. And so there was a lot of eyeballs on me. And so after that was done, I was like, I'm gonna take a break, and I'm just gonna relax for a year. And then I came here. So like, yeah, so that is my journey with the Raspberry Pi, and I feel like, you know, everybody who gets a hold of this thing does some pretty cool stuff. So
Maybe not
yeah.
record holding, but
Maybe not record. Any questions? Any?
So your name's in the Guinness?
Yeah. Yeah. There's a link on my website.
You have a
Yeah.
website?
Yeah, oddlystudios.com. Yeah. There's other stuff on there, but yep, that's my presentation.
Was that 2017?
For the Pan Am Games, I don't remember. Maybe, yeah, I think it was. Yeah. Something like, or maybe 2016. I really want to build stuff with you guys, you know? Like, we're in a really unique position here, and, you know, we're making software for showing this kind of stuff. Like, we should do it.